Grace Hensley had not stepped foot in the village of Elmswood for over 20 years. The air smelled the same, wet earth and smoke from old chimneys, but everything else felt different. More distant. Colder. The taxi stopped in front of the house at the end of Holloway Lane, its stone walls half covered in ivy, windows staring blankly like forgotten eyes. She stood in silence, suitcase by her side, while the driver unloaded her bags and drove off without a word. The house belonged to her mother, Alice Hensley, who had died suddenly just 2 weeks earlier. A small, private funeral. No neighbors came. No flowers. Just the vicar, the gravedigger, and Grace, trying to feel something more than numbness. She pushed open the iron gate and stepped onto the overgrown path. The front door creaked like a wounded animal as it opened. Inside, the air was thick and still. Furniture covered in white sheets stood like ghosts waiting for permission to breathe. Dust floated in sunbeams from the tall, narrow windows. Grace didn't remember it being so quiet. Her plan was simple: sort through the belongings, contact an estate agent, and sell the property as quickly as possible. She had a life in London, a demanding job, a partner who wasn't exactly thrilled about her extended stay in Yorkshire. But something in her chest twisted as she stepped into the sitting room. On the mantelpiece above the cold fireplace stood a cracked photograph of her and her mother. Grace was barely 5, her fringe uneven, her hand clutching her mother's scarf. She remembered that day. They had gone to the fair. But the photo had been slashed with something sharp, and a single word was written in faded pen at the corner. Liar. She stared at it, trying to make sense of the strange feeling crawling up her spine. The photo wasn't like this before. Who had done it? And why? That night, she lit a fire in the grate and settled into one of the old armchairs. The silence in the house was almost unbearable. No ticking clock. No hum of a fridge. Just the wind sighing through the chimney and the distant hoot of an owl. And then, sometime after midnight, she heard it. A soft, dragging sound from above. The attic. She froze. Another sound, like something being shuffled. Or someone. The floorboards above her moaned quietly. Grace stood slowly, every muscle tense. She stared up at the ceiling. Nothing more. No footsteps. No voice. Just stillness again. She didn't go up that night. She stayed downstairs with the fire burning low and the photo of her mother face down on the table. By morning, she told herself it had been a dream. An old house settling. Nothing more. But even as she stood sipping tea by the frosted kitchen window, she could feel it. The house was watching her. The attic door was just as she remembered it, narrow, paint peeling, with an iron latch that hadn't moved in years. Grace stood at the top of the stairs, heart thudding, the air colder here than in the rest of the house. She hadn't planned to come up, but the noise last night had stirred something she couldn't quite ignore. She reached for the latch. It didn't budge. Frowning, she tried again, both hands gripping the old metal. It was locked. Of course it was. Her mother had always kept the attic closed, claiming it was unsafe, full of rotting beams and broken floorboards. But Grace had been up there once, when she was 8, sneaking past her mother during a thunderstorm. She remembered trunks. Old books. A dollhouse. And a mirror covered in a black cloth. She also remembered being dragged back down by her mother, face pale and voice shaking. That day, Alice didn't raise her voice. She didn't punish her. She simply cried. Grace had forgotten that until now. She searched the drawers in the hallway for the attic key, but found nothing. Her mother's old bureau was still in the corner of the study, a heavy oak piece filled with letters, bank statements, and ancient shopping lists. She sifted through each drawer carefully, her hands moving past faded receipts and broken pens. At the very back of the bottom drawer, her fingers touched something cold. A key. Rusty, small, and sharp-edged. She held it tightly as she made her way back upstairs. The key slid into the attic door and turned with a groan. Inside, the air was dry and sour. Dust clouded with every step. Grace covered her mouth and moved cautiously across the creaking floorboards. It looked just as she remembered, boxes piled like tombstones, forgotten furniture draped in cloth, the dollhouse sitting crooked in the far corner. But the mirror was uncovered. It stood tall, framed in wood so dark it was nearly black, the glass warped and fogged with time. She moved closer and saw her reflection, not quite right. Her face looked older, more hollow. Behind her, in the mirror, something flickered, a shadow. She spun around. Nothing. Just the dusty attic. A cold breeze swept across her arms, but no windows were open. The attic had no windows. She walked to a chest by the far wall and opened it. Inside were clothes, her baby clothes, folded carefully. Her father's scarf. A bundle of letters tied in blue ribbon. She picked one up. The handwriting was her mother's, but the envelope was addressed to someone else. Margaret Hensley. Her grandmother. She frowned. She had never known her mother kept in touch with Margaret. The two had stopped speaking long before Grace was born. Her mother had always said the woman was cruel. Dangerous. Grace had always believed she was dead. She opened the first letter. Dearest Margaret. I know you told me never to write again, but I have nowhere else to turn. Grace is asking questions. She remembers more than she should. I fear she will uncover it all. Grace's hands trembled as she read the rest. The letter spoke of secrets, of what happened that night, and the burden Alice had carried for years. But the final line chilled her. I can hear her again, upstairs in the attic. Please tell me I am not going mad. The floor creaked behind her. Grace turned, heart slamming against her ribs. Nothing. But the mirror was no longer empty. Her reflection was still there. But she was not alone. The morning after her discovery in the attic, Grace drove into the village to find answers. Elmswood was quiet, as always, with its grey stone cottages and narrow lanes twisting between hedgerows. But this time, she saw it differently. Every closed curtain, every glance averted as she passed, felt like a silent message. People knew something. They just wouldn't speak. She parked near the old bakery and entered the village shop, bell chiming overhead. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Doyle, the shopkeeper who had once sold her penny sweets as a child. The woman looked older now, her back more hunched, but her sharp eyes hadn't changed. Morning, Grace said, trying to sound casual. It's been a long time. Mrs. Doyle blinked, then gave a tight smile. You're Alice's girl. I thought I saw you at the church. Grace nodded. I've come to sort the house. The old woman studied her for a moment, then looked away. Such a shame. Your mother kept to herself. Quiet, always polite. There was a pause. Do you remember my grandmother? Grace asked. Margaret Hensley. The smile vanished. Mrs. Doyle turned to adjust the shelf behind her. No one's mentioned that name in years. Grace waited, but the woman remained silent. She tried again. Was she still alive when I was born? Another pause. Don't go digging, love. The past's better left where it is. Grace left the shop with a tight knot in her chest. She stopped by the cemetery on her way back. The churchyard was overgrown, headstones leaning like tired shoulders. Her mother's grave was new, the soil still fresh. She knelt beside it and noticed something curious. One of the nearby graves was marked Margaret Hensley, with no date of death. Only one word below the name. Condemned. She stared at it, chilled. Who carved that? And why would a grave be marked without a death date? Back at the house, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay in the letters. That evening, she opened more of them, her hands trembling as the words unfurled dark threads. Margaret. I warned you what would happen if you interfered again. She's growing more curious, and I can't keep her away from the attic much longer. The mirror reacts to her. Not to me. I believe the blood remembers. Grace stood suddenly, as if the attic itself could hear her reading. She went back upstairs. The mirror remained where it was. But now, lying in front of it, was something new. A photograph. It showed a young girl with long dark hair and pale eyes. Not Grace. Someone else. On the back, written in Alice's handwriting. Eleanor. Age 7. Grace stared at the name. She had never heard it before. The fire crackled softly downstairs, but upstairs, everything stood still. Except the mirror. In the warped glass, the girl from the photo was smiling. That night, the air in the house grew heavier, as though the walls had begun to breathe. Grace lit every lamp she could find, unwilling to sit in shadow. She tried calling her partner in London, but the phone kept losing signal. Even the landline crackled with static. She didn't sleep. At dawn, she returned to the attic. The photo of Eleanor was still there, lying in front of the mirror, untouched. She picked it up again, studying the girl's face, those haunting pale eyes, so unlike her own. Grace had no memory of ever meeting someone named Eleanor. But the name felt lodged somewhere in the back of her mind, like a splinter. She began to search the attic more thoroughly. Behind a stack of chairs and an old pram, she found a narrow doorway she hadn't seen before, partly hidden behind a hanging tapestry. The wood around the frame was warped, as though it had once been nailed shut. Her fingers hesitated on the handle. It opened. The room beyond was small, almost claustrophobic, with a low ceiling and slanted roof. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, its pattern a nursery of rabbits and stars. A child's bed sat beneath the single light bulb, the covers undisturbed, a stuffed lamb resting on the pillow. It looked like no one had entered in years. Grace stepped in slowly. There were drawings pinned to the wall. Crayon sketches of a house. A woman. A mirror. And in each one, a dark figure in the corner, scribbled in black so thick it tore the paper. In one drawing, the figure stood behind a girl, its hands reaching for her hair. Grace's breath caught. She opened the wardrobe and found more clothes, small dresses, shoes. On the shelf was a diary, its pages yellowed with age. She sat cross-legged on the floor and began to read. March 17th. Mummy said I'm not allowed to look in the mirror anymore. She covered it with the black cloth. But I can still hear her when I sleep. The lady in the mirror. She says she's my real mummy. April 2nd. Margaret came to the door again. Mummy said never to speak to her. But I think she cried when she left. She said I used to live with her. May 5th. Mummy screamed at the mirror last night. She said, stay away from her, she's mine. I don't want to sleep here anymore. Grace closed the diary. Every hair on her arms stood on end. The room didn't just feel forgotten, it felt hidden. She turned to leave, but something made her glance back. There, above the bed, was a name carved into the wooden beam. Eleanor. No one had painted over it. No one had tried to erase it. But Grace never remembered this room being here. And suddenly, she wasn't sure if Eleanor had ever left. The mirror no longer sat passively in the attic. Grace began to notice changes each time she passed it. The dust seemed disturbed around its base. Once, she found it tilted slightly to the left, as if someone had turned it. She never did. And more than once, she caught a glimpse of something moving in the glass, too quick to catch, but unmistakably there. She stopped sleeping. The house whispered constantly now. Floorboards creaked when no one walked. Doors clicked shut behind her. Shadows shifted just outside her vision. Grace no longer trusted the silence. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. She buried herself in the letters, trying to piece together the truth. Her mother had written dozens, maybe hundreds, all addressed to Margaret but never sent. They told of voices in the night, Eleanor's drawings, and a growing fear that the mirror held something more than reflection. One line stood out. I saw her hand reach out. I felt it on my shoulder. But Eleanor was asleep. And I was alone. Grace took the diary from Eleanor's room and compared the entries. They overlapped. The same nights. The same dreams. The same whispered name, Mother. One letter, dated just 2 months before Alice's death, was smeared with tears. Grace is beginning to forget. It's working. I did what you asked. I buried Eleanor. Not in the ground. In her memory. She can't remember. She mustn't. Grace slammed the letter down. She was never meant to know. Back in the attic, she stood in front of the mirror again. Her hands trembled. She whispered Eleanor's name, expecting nothing. The mirror rippled. Like water. And then, for the first time, the reflection changed. It was her face, but younger. 7, maybe 8 years old. The same fringe. The same dress from an old family photo. And standing behind her, not quite touching, was the girl from the photograph. Eleanor. She wasn't smiling this time. Grace took a step back, but the girl in the glass stayed still. Staring. Watching. The attic temperature dropped, her breath visible in the air. And then, the girl raised her hand and pressed it to the glass. Grace's hand lifted instinctively, meeting the gesture. And for the briefest moment, she felt something cold and small curl around her fingers. The mirror cracked. A thin, splintered line from corner to corner. And as it did, a voice echoed from behind her, not from the mirror. Not a whisper. A child's voice. Soft. Familiar. You forgot me. Grace spent the next morning sifting through every corner of the attic, driven by something she couldn't quite name. Fear. Guilt. Recognition. The cracked mirror stood silently, its surface dull now, as if it had given all it could for now. In a suitcase buried beneath rotting blankets, she found more clues. A small hospital bracelet with the name Eleanor Whitmore. Her own surname. A birth certificate, wrinkled and water-stained, listing Eleanor as born 2 years before Grace, to Alice Whitmore. No father named. The address matched this very house. Grace sat back, legs folded, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. She hadn't imagined her. Eleanor had existed. She had been her sister. Downstairs, the silence stretched unnaturally. Grace stood slowly, taking the documents with her. She walked to the study, sat at her mother's writing desk, and pulled open the final drawer she hadn't dared open before. Inside, neatly arranged, was a worn leather journal. It belonged to her mother. She opened it. July 8th. She stood in front of the mirror again last night. I told her to stop. But she says she can hear singing. That the woman in the mirror tells her stories. I begged Margaret for help. She said I should never have kept the mirror. August 2nd. It's getting worse. Eleanor barely speaks to me now. She wakes up crying, says the lady is calling her. She said something terrifying this morning. She said, she showed me Grace. September 14th. Margaret says I must choose. That only one can stay. I told her she was mad. But then Eleanor began changing. Her drawings, her laughter. I don't know who she is anymore. I'm scared. The last entry was dated the night before Grace's 7th birthday. September 29th. She tried to pull Grace into the mirror. I caught her just in time. She smiled at me, but it wasn't my daughter's smile. I shut the door. I locked it. I did what I had to do. Grace closed the journal, unable to breathe. Her mother hadn't banished Eleanor to protect her. She had sealed her away to stop something far worse. A presence. Possession. Down the hallway, the floor creaked. Grace stood, gripping the journal tightly. She walked slowly through the house, following the noise. It led her to the narrow corridor behind the kitchen, the same one that once led to the old coal cellar. The door was ajar. A whisper drifted up. Faint. Like breath on cold glass. Come see. Grace descended the stairs. The air in the coal cellar was cold and wet, thick with the scent of damp stone and mold. Grace descended the stairs slowly, her hand brushing the rough wall for balance. The torchlight from her phone flickered once, then steadied. The room at the bottom was larger than she remembered, and far older. The bricks here weren't part of the renovation her father had done, they were ancient, lined with moss and salt. She stepped further in. In the center of the cellar was a large wooden crate, covered in dust and cobwebs. Grace approached it, heart hammering in her ears. Carved faintly on the lid was a name. Eleanor. She hesitated, then slowly prized it open. Inside was a child's mattress. Torn fabric. Pieces of broken toys. Scraps of paper. She lifted one, a drawing. It showed a little girl sitting in front of a mirror, her hands pressed to the glass. On the other side, another face stared back, older, darker, identical. Grace swallowed hard. The edges of the page were burned. Something shuffled behind her. She spun around. A girl stood in the shadows near the far wall, not moving, her face obscured by darkness. Grace's torchlight barely reached her, but she saw the outline of long hair. Small hands. Eleanor. She whispered. The girl stepped forward, into the light. Her face was not Eleanor's. It was Grace. But not the Grace she was now, the child from the mirror. Pale. Silent. Her expression blank, eyes wide and empty. I tried to save you, the figure said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. Grace stumbled back. What do you mean? You were meant to go, the voice continued. She picked me. But I wouldn't leave. So she locked me away. The child's head tilted slowly. I never forgot. Grace's skin prickled. You're not real. I am what you left behind. The torchlight flickered again. Shadows crept up the walls, and the sound of breathing, low and rhythmic, filled the room though no one else was there. The child reached out a hand. You opened the mirror, she said softly. Now I can cross. No, Grace backed away, clutching the journal to her chest. This is my life. My body. The walls groaned around her, like the house itself was listening. The child's face cracked into a wide, unnatural smile. But I remember how it felt to be chosen. She lunged forward. The light went out. Darkness swallowed everything.